The sun was already sinking low over the plains when Elijah Cole rode into the edge of town, dust clinging to the hem of his coat and silence sitting heavy on his shoulders. He wasn't a man of many words, never had been. People in Clearwater just called him that quiet farmer out near Widow's Pass. Alone on 60 acres of land, Elijah didn't bother with company. His only companions were his horse, his windmill, and the sound of grass moving in the wind. But that day, something pulled him off his normal route. Something strange. He found her behind the livestock pens at the edge of the trading post. Small, still, wrapped in a dress 2 sizes too thin for the weather. Her hands were raw, fingers fidgeting with the frayed hem of her skirt. Hair dark as pitch, face streaked with dust. But her eyes were watching everything. Sharp, quiet, waiting. Elijah didn't speak, just stood near the fence watching her from beneath the brim of his hat. The man beside her, a thick-necked, red-eyed brute in a whiskey-stained vest, spoke first. "Don't mind her," he said, slurring. "Can't talk anyhow. Got no voice, not right in the head." He grinned. "Pretty thing, though, huh?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "What's your business with her?" he asked, voice low, gravelly. The man shrugged. "My daughter. Useless as a mule, but eats just the same. I'm selling her. She'll make good cleaning up or picking berries. $20 and she's yours." Elijah didn't flinch, didn't ask her name, didn't ask how she came to be treated like cattle. He just looked at her, really looked, and something inside him cracked. He tossed a handful of coins on the barrel between them. "Done," the man laughed. "She don't speak, you know, not a word. You'll be talking to dirt." Elijah turned to her, meeting her gaze. "I don't mind silence," he said. Then he reached out a calloused hand. She looked at it for a long moment, and then, slowly, cautiously, placed hers in his. They rode out before dusk finished falling, not a word spoken between them. Just 2 shadows slipping into the coming night, one broken by the world, the other too used to loneliness to even notice anymore. But something had changed. Neither of them would be alone much longer. The road back to Elijah's farm was long, winding through pale hills and brittle grass that whispered with every gust. The girl sat side saddle behind him on the horse, her hands clutching the saddle horn, her body stiff with uncertainty. She hadn't spoken once. Not on the road, not at the post, not even when he helped her into the saddle. But Elijah didn't press her. He simply rode, steady and sure, as if carrying silence was something he'd long since gotten used to. When they reached the farmhouse, a modest cabin of weathered pine and hand-cut stone, he helped her down carefully. "You hungry?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder as he led the horse to the barn. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She just stood, barefoot in the dust, eyes scanning everything as if trying to memorize her new prison, or perhaps her first taste of freedom. Inside, Elijah lit a lantern and placed a tin bowl of stew on the table. He motioned for her to sit. She approached cautiously, as if afraid it might be taken away the moment she reached for it. When she finally did eat, quietly, ravenously, he said nothing, just leaned back in his chair, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. He studied her only with side glances. No bruises. No fresh ones, anyway. But scars. Faint ones on her wrists. One on her cheek, near the jawline. She was young, maybe 18, maybe younger, but her eyes had seen too much. After dinner, he handed her a quilt and pointed to the small bedroom down the hall. "You'll sleep there," he said. "I'll take the cot by the fire." She hesitated in the doorway, then turned slowly, her voice barely above breath. "I'm not dumb." Elijah looked up sharply. It was the first time he'd heard her speak. The words weren't loud, but they were clear, sharp as broken glass. "I never thought you were," he said, voice softer now. She nodded once and disappeared into the room, the door clicking shut behind her. Elijah sat at the hearth for a long time, staring into the fire. He didn't know what kind of hell she came from, but now she was here. And somehow, in the quiet, something inside him stirred that hadn't moved in years. The next morning, the prairie was cloaked in fog, thick and low, like the world had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. Elijah rose early, as always, fed the chickens, checked the corral, split kindling near the shed with slow, practiced swings. By the time the girl stepped onto the porch, wrapped in the same thin dress and his old wool shawl, the sun was just beginning to burn the mist away. He didn't say a word, just handed her a metal cup of warm tea and nodded toward the bench. She sat, carefully, not beside him, but not too far either. They sipped in silence, the kind that didn't feel awkward, just knew. Elijah finally spoke. "What's your name?" She hesitated. Then, barely audible, she said, "Mara." It wasn't the name he expected, but it fit. Short, strong, like a word forged in heat and kept in the mouth like a secret. He didn't push her for more. Instead, he went back to work, mending the fence posts and patching the roof line. Mara followed at a distance, quiet, watchful, never asking questions but always listening. And she noticed everything. How the gate latch caught wrong, how the right-hand colt favored its back leg, how Elijah rubbed his shoulder when the clouds thickened, an old injury flaring in the cold. She didn't speak again that day, but she laid out his dinner plate without being asked, folded the quilt at the foot of his cot. And when she passed by the fire that night, she whispered, "I can work?" He nodded. "You don't owe me anything, Mara." She looked at him, jaw tight. "I know." They shared stew by firelight. He didn't ask what made her go mute all those years. Didn't ask why she'd chosen now to speak. Some silences weren't made to be broken. Some were meant to be heard. And he was listening. Days slipped by like water through fingers. Quiet, unhurried, and oddly warm in a way neither of them expected. Mara didn't speak much, but she worked. Harder than most hands Elijah had hired over the years. She swept the porch, patched a tear in the feed sacks, even mended a worn-out stirrup strap using nothing but twine and quiet determination. Every night she sat by the fire with him, sometimes knitting, sometimes just being there. And Elijah found something peaceful in the rhythm of it all. No noise, no judgment, just two people surviving in the same slow orbit. One afternoon, Elijah caught her in the barn, humming under her breath. It wasn't much of a song, just a broken melody barely carried by the dust, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just listened. When she realized he was there, she went still, wide-eyed, like a deer about to bolt, but he only smiled. "You've got a nice voice." Mara lowered her head. "You think I'm lying?" "No, I think maybe you're just not used to hearing anything kind." Later that night, the wind picked up. A dry storm rolling across the plains. Lightning flashed over the far hills, turning the clouds into strange, flickering ghosts. Mara stood by the window, watching the sky churn. "Elijah," she said softly, "what happens if I stay?" He looked up from his whittling. "You mean for a while?" She turned, her hands gripping the window frame. "I mean, really stay." Elijah set the carving knife down and met her eyes. "Then this place becomes just as much yours as it is mine." Mara blinked. "Even if I've got nothing?" "You've got more than most." "What?" He didn't hesitate. "Heart, grit, and something that can't be bought." She didn't answer, but her throat tightened, and her hand touched the scar on her jaw, a gesture Elijah had learned meant she was feeling something she didn't yet know how to say. And in that storm-lit silence, something invisible shifted between them. Not romance, not yet, but trust, the kind that could grow if given time, and wasn't crushed by asking too much too soon. By mid-spring, the land had begun to thaw, and so had Mara. She spoke more often now. Quiet words at breakfast, short questions in the barn, the occasional joke so dry you had to watch her lips twitch to know it was real. Elijah took notice of every one of them. Not because he was trying to fix her, or because he thought her story was something that could be solved like a broken fence post, but because each word was a choice, and she was choosing life. One morning, they rode out together to check the southern pasture. Elijah handed her the reins to an old mare named Clover, skittish, gentle, like Mara in a way. She hesitated. Clover knows her way," he said. "You just have to trust her. And yourself." With one shaky breath, she climbed up, and for the first time since she arrived, she smiled without realizing it. They rode in silence for a while until the old boundary fence came into view, bent and half swallowed by last season's wind. Elijah dismounted. Mara followed. They worked side by side, looping wire, setting new stakes, their hands brushing now and then. Every touch was light, unspoken, but it sent a thrum through the air. After a long pause, she said, "My father never let me ride. Said it made women think they were free." Elijah kept his eyes on the fence post. "You are free." Her voice cracked. "I don't know what that means." "You'll figure it out," he said gently. "Out here, it's hard not to." That night, back at the cabin, Elijah made coffee the old way, boiled strong with a touch of molasses. He handed her a cup and leaned against the doorframe. "You ever think about leaving?" Mara stared into the steam. "I used to dream about escape, but I never dreamed about after." He nodded slowly. "That's the hardest part." She looked at him. "What's your after?" Elijah gave her a tired smile. "I stopped dreaming a long time ago. Figured I'd live quiet and die quieter." Mara tilted her head. "But now?" He didn't answer. Not with words. But his eyes held something new. Something that hadn't been there in years. Possibility. A week later, word reached the farm. News carried by an old cattle trader passing through. He'd stopped for water and conversation, but left behind something colder than spring wind. "Saw Elias Trummond 3 towns over," he said, pausing to scratch his beard. "Mean son of a gun. Said he was looking for a girl that ran off." Elijah stiffened. Mara had gone still behind the stove, her back to the room. Said she was his blood, claimed someone stole her. The man chuckled, not realizing the weight of his words. Might be trouble coming, if the fella gets bold enough. Elijah didn't say anything, just nodded and sent the man off with a fresh canteen. When the dust of the traveler's wagon finally faded, he turned to Mara. She was trembling. That night, neither of them slept. Mara sat on the edge of her bed, her hands gripping the worn quilt. "He'll come," she said. "He always does." Elijah leaned against the doorway. "Not here. You don't know him." "I don't have to." She looked up, her voice sharper than he'd heard in weeks. "You think you can stop a man like him? He beat 6 men in town because one looked at me too long." Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I'm not one of those 6. The next day, Elijah rode into town. He didn't say why, but Mara knew. When he returned, he brought back supplies. A new lock, 2 extra bolts for the front door, a Winchester with polished wood and enough cartridges to hold a line if he had to. But most important, he brought back a paper, filed with the local judge. A legal declaration of protection. Her name was there. Mara Calloway. Not as property, not as a dependent, but as a person. Someone worth defending. That night, Elijah sat on the porch while Mara leaned beside him. They didn't speak for a long time. The sky stretched wide above them, full of stars. Then she asked softly, "Why are you doing this?" He sipped his coffee. "Because some folks only speak in fists, and others never got the chance to speak at all." Mara turned toward him. "And me?" He met her eyes. "You're finding your voice." And just like that, she leaned her head gently against his shoulder. No fear, no hesitation, just quiet trust. And beneath it all, the slow bloom of something stronger than fear. The wind carried tension that week. It whistled through the grass differently. The horses pawed at the dirt restlessly. Even the chickens clucked with nervous rhythm. Mara felt it too. Every shadow seemed longer. Every knock on the door pulled her breath short. But Elijah remained steady. He taught her how to aim the rifle. Not for violence, but for power. "Hold it firm," he said, guiding her hands. "You don't shoot unless you mean it. But if you do, don't flinch." She nodded. Her hands shook at first, but each shot steadied her more, until by day's end, she hit the bottle perched on the fence post. She didn't smile, but Elijah did. The next evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, they sat on the porch like they always did. Elijah handed her a blanket, and she wrapped it around her shoulders. There was peace in the way they existed together. Quiet but rich, like a stream beneath winter ice. "I remember once," she said suddenly, "when I was 10, I saw a butterfly land on my hand. My father slapped it away. Said softness made me weak." Elijah didn't respond at first. Then he said, "The hardest men I've known were cowards in silence. Softness isn't weakness. It's choosing to keep your soul." Mara blinked, eyes hot. "Do you think I still have one?" Elijah looked at her, voice low and certain. "I think it's louder than ever." The next morning the dusk came. A single rider on a dark horse, slow, deliberate, the kind of gait that spoke of cruel patience. Mara saw the figure through the kitchen window and dropped the bowl she was holding. Elijah had already walked outside. Elias Trummond dismounted like he owned the land. His beard was thicker now, grayer, but the sneer on his face hadn't aged a day. "You got something belongs to me," he said. Elijah stood, arms crossed. "I don't see your name on anyone here." "She's my daughter. Ran off like a thief in the night." "She's not a thing. You want to speak to her, ask her, but you don't get to demand." Elias's hand drifted to his belt, just enough to let the threat hang in the air. Inside, Mara picked up the rifle Elijah taught her to use. Her hands were cold, but her breath was steady. She stepped out onto the porch. "I'm not going back." Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like lightning. Elias turned, lips curled in disbelief. "You think this farmhand's got your blood now?" Mara raised the rifle. "No, but I do." For the first time in her life, Elias backed down. Not because of the gun, but because the girl he once controlled had become a woman who wouldn't flinch. He spit in the dirt, turned, and rode off. Elijah exhaled. Mara lowered the rifle. That night they didn't speak much, but Mara took Elijah's hand on the porch and didn't let go. Not once, and neither of them looked behind them again. The next few days passed quietly, but something fundamental had shifted. The ranch felt more like theirs. Not just Elijah's, not just a place to run to, but a home where Mara had chosen to stand her ground. And Elijah, he'd never realized how empty his life had been until it was filled with someone else's courage. They built new fence lines together, repaired what the wind had battered. Every chore felt less like labor and more like weaving something sacred into the earth. One morning, while Elijah mended a post near the well, Mara brought him coffee. Strong, just the way he liked it. He looked up, surprised. "I was watching how you make it," she said. "Figured I'd give it a try." He sipped, then raised his brows. Better than mine. She smiled shyly, then added, I wanted to give back. For everything. Elijah shook his head gently. You already have. That night a storm rolled in. Soft at first, just thunder murmuring over the hills. They stayed up late, sitting on the floor near the fire, an old patchwork quilt between them. The lantern cast a warm halo, and outside rain tapped gently against the roof. Elijah shared stories, ones he rarely told, about a brother who never came back from war, about why he'd chosen this land, this life, this silence. I didn't think anyone would ever sit here beside me, he said. Didn't think I deserved it. Mara looked at him, eyes soft. And now? I think maybe I was just waiting for the right person. Their hands brushed. Neither of them pulled away. In the days that followed, small things blossomed. Mara laughed more. She started humming while feeding the chickens. She stitched new curtains for the cabin windows, pale blue with little embroidered stars. Because it gets so dark out here, she said, and I want the house to remember the sky. Elijah built a bench under the old oak tree behind the barn. For thinking, he told her, or not thinking. They ate meals together like rituals, wordless and warm. They were building something, not just survival, but belonging. But peace doesn't always come without echoes. One afternoon, while riding near the ridge, Mara found a weathered ribbon tied around a broken branch. It was hers, a piece of her past, and with it came the realization. She wasn't afraid anymore. She went home that night, tucked the ribbon into a small wooden box, and placed it on the shelf, among other quiet relics. Elijah noticed but didn't ask, because he didn't need to. He understood. Spring was creeping across the land, leaving color in its wake. Yellow wildflowers, sun-warmed soil, and the soft green blush of life renewed. Mara took to reading aloud in the evenings. She'd found a tattered book in the loft, poetry, old and frayed, and now her voice, though quiet, wrapped the cabin in rhythm and light. Elijah, usually lost in his own thoughts, found himself listening to the music in her words. Each night her voice reached places inside him untouched for years. He never said it aloud, but he knew. She was healing both of them. One dusky evening, as they finished a modest dinner, Elijah stepped outside to check the horses. That's when he saw the man. A lone figure on horseback, paused at the edge of the field, just beyond the eastern fence, watching, waiting. The stranger made no move to come closer. No wave, no signal, just the slow turning of his horse and the quiet ride back toward the horizon. Elijah's jaw clenched. He said nothing to Mara that night, but the next morning he oiled the rifle again. Later that day, Mara found him in the barn. She didn't need to ask. She'd felt it too. A chill, a memory stitched into the wind. Elijah? She said softly. He didn't turn. He was here. She nodded. I thought so. Elijah finally looked at her. He's testing us, watching, waiting to see if I scare. Mara walked closer, touched the wood stock of the rifle where he held it. I'm not running. That stopped him cold. Not because she said it, but because she meant it. You sure? She took a deep breath. I've never been more sure of anything. That night, she didn't sleep in the small room near the kitchen. She moved her pillow beside the hearth where Elijah slept. Not in his arms, not yet, but beside him, close. Her presence was no longer fleeting, no longer fragile, and Elijah knew he would not let the past take her again. Whatever came, they would meet it together. The next day, Elijah rode to town. Mara stayed behind. She walked the fence line twice, then 3 times. A habit now. That's when she found it. A mark, carved into the wooden post. Just a symbol, but she knew it. Her father had used it to mark his property. Her hand trembled, but she didn't cry. She went inside, sat at the table, and waited. Not for rescue, but for Elijah, because this time, she wasn't facing it alone. By the time Elijah returned from town, Mara was already outside, waiting on the porch. She didn't greet him with a smile that day, just a steady gaze and a single word. He's close. Elijah dismounted, reading her expression like scripture. What happened? She told him. About the mark on the post. About what it meant. About the man who had once claimed her silence, her body, her fear, and now dared to reach into her new life and leave his sign like a shadow across the sun. Elijah's voice dropped low. We've come too far for him to take that from you. Mara didn't flinch. He's not taking anything, not this time. They spent that night preparing, not with fear, but with intention. Elijah checked every latch, every rifle, every trail near the ridge. He moved the horses deeper into the canyon corral and reinforced the barn door. Mara packed a small satchel, not to flee, but to be ready. And when darkness fell, they sat side by side at the hearth. No words, only the sound of the fire and the quiet conviction between them. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He covered her hand with his. And they stayed that way until sleep claimed them both. At dawn, hoofbeats broke the silence, not the cautious trot of a traveler. No, this was deliberate. Heavy. Elijah stepped outside. A tall man waited at the fence, dressed in worn black and smelling of the road. His eyes were hard and his smile didn't reach them. "Got something to mind, cowboy?" the man said. Elijah's voice was steel. "No, you don't." Mara stepped into view. The man's expression shifted, recognition, then mockery. "You gonna hide behind him, girl?" he said. "You never spoke a word before. I reckon you still don't have one now." Mara's voice rose, clear and unwavering. "I choose to speak now, and I chose to leave you." A silence followed. Then Elijah stepped forward between them. "She's not alone anymore," he said. The man's lip curled. "You think this ends here?" Elijah didn't blink. "I know it does." The man turned his horse, spat, and rode off. But the threat hadn't vanished. They both knew he'd be back. That night, Mara placed her old ribbon, the one she'd once kept hidden, into the fire. It curled, caught flame, and disappeared into ash. "Good riddance," she whispered. "And Elijah?" He kissed her temple and whispered back, "You're not hers anymore, you're yours." And for the first time in years, she believed it. The wind changed the next day. It swept over the plains like a whisper of things unfinished. Fences creaked, tree limbs stirred without cause, and even the horses kept their ears perked toward the ridge. Elijah rode the property twice before noon. Each hoofbeat on the dry ground echoed like a warning. He didn't tell Mara, but he saw signs. Twigs broken clean, boot tracks by the creek, and a rope hanging too neatly from an old pine. Someone had been watching. Back at the cabin, Mara worked in silence. She kneaded dough, folded laundry, stirred soup, but her hands trembled slightly and every creak made her flinch. Elijah placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "We leave tonight, just for a day or two. There's a safe spot in the canyon." She shook her head slowly. "Running gives him power." "I'm not running," Elijah said. "I'm protecting." But Mara wouldn't go. Instead, she showed him something. A small wooden box buried under the floorboard. Inside, letters, not written by her, but by him. Her father. Dozens of them, sent after she ran, all unopened. "I never read them," Mara said, "because nothing he could say would undo what he did." Elijah looked into her eyes. "Then we burn them." But Mara shook her head again. "No, I'll bury them, like the man who wrote them. I don't need revenge, Elijah. I need peace." And so they did. Together, they walked to the back pasture, dug a hole beside a young juniper tree, and laid the letters to rest. Mara whispered something into the wind. "You can't touch me anymore." And the tree swayed as if it had heard her. That evening, the sky turned copper. Clouds bruised and deepened. Distant thunder crawled across the horizon like a warning drum. As Elijah saddled his horses for safety's sake, a gunshot cracked the silence. He ran to the porch and saw Mara standing just inside the doorway, eyes wide, hand pressed to her chest. "I saw him," she whispered. "In the trees." Elijah grabbed his rifle, heart pounding. But by the time he reached the trees, the shadows had swallowed everything. No figure, no sound, no footprints, just a message carved into the bark of a pine. "She's still mine." Elijah returned to the cabin, fury in his veins. But Mara stood taller than he'd ever seen her. "We end this," she said. "No more hiding." Elijah nodded. "Tomorrow, we ride into town. Sheriff, judge, whoever it takes. I won't let him hunt you like an animal." Mara looked out the window, into the darkness, where her past still lingered, then whispered, steady as dawn, "He's not the hunter anymore, Elijah. I am." Morning came, but not with the warmth of spring. The sky was veiled in silver clouds, and the wind had gone still, like the world was holding its breath. Elijah saddled the horses while Mara packed a simple bag, a shawl, her mother's brooch, and the letters she hadn't buried. "Why bring them?" Elijah asked gently. Mara held his gaze. "Proof, in case the law needs reminding of who he really is." They rode in silence, the trail stretching long beneath them, cutting through wheat fields and hills, through memories Mara once thought she'd never revisit. When they arrived in town, folks stared. They always did when Elijah showed up. Tall, scarred, silent. But this time their eyes shifted quickly to the woman beside him. Some recognized her, some whispered. But none dared speak aloud the stories they thought they knew. Elijah tied the horses outside the sheriff's office. Sheriff Grant was older than his badge, but his eyes were sharp. He stood when Mara walked in. "Mara Trummond, I thought you were gone?" she asked. He nodded once, or worse. She didn't flinch. "My father's looking for me. I want a statement filed. And protection. Legal." An hour later, they stood in front of Judge Harlan, who listened with a grave face as Mara recounted for the first time aloud what had happened in that house. No shouting, no tears, just facts. Elijah watched from the bench, hands folded, jaw tight. Every word she spoke was a hammer driving nails into the coffin of the past. When she finished, Harlan removed his glasses. We'll issue a warrant. If your father sets foot in this county, we'll hold him. You're safe now. Mara gave a slow nod, not because she believed in magic words, but because she knew she was no longer alone. They walked out into the sunlight together, and Elijah offered her a quiet smile. You did it. She shook her head, eyes bright. We did. That evening, they stayed in town. Elijah paid for a small room above the general store. Nothing fancy, but it had clean sheets and a door with a bolt. As the sun lowered beyond the rooftops, Mara stood by the window. The town bustled below, alive in a way the prairie never was. Feels strange, she murmured, to speak and be heard. Elijah stepped beside her. Your voice isn't small, Mara. It was just hidden behind fear. She turned to him. You heard it. I always did. And there in the fading light she touched his hand, not trembling, not cautious, but certain. For the first time she wasn't running from her past. She was walking toward her future, with him. Back at the farm, everything looked unchanged, yet everything felt different. Mara dismounted first, her boots meeting the dirt like they belonged. Elijah stayed a moment longer, watching her walk toward the porch with a calm steadiness he hadn't seen in her before. He followed after her in silence, as always. It feels smaller now, she said, nodding at the house. The fear, I mean. Elijah opened the door and let her step in first. That's 'cause you've grown past it. They settled back into rhythm. But the rhythm wasn't what it used to be. Mara had begun humming in the kitchen. She laughed once, when a hen startled her by pecking her boot. She spoke more often, not always with words, but with her eyes, her hands, her posture. And Elijah? He listened, like he always had. Then came the letter. A ranch boy from the next valley brought it by horseback. Elijah read it once, brow furrowing slightly, before passing it to Mara. She read it aloud. Elias Drummond arrested. Caught trying to claim guardianship over another girl. Sheriff Grant testified. Mara Calloway named in the record as witness. Charges pending. She folded the paper slowly and exhaled. It's over. That night, Mara stepped out into the dark with no shawl. Elijah sat on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar, but looked up when he heard her. She stood still beneath the stars. I want to burn the letters. Elijah nodded once. Do you want me to do it? She shook her head. No, I need to. So they built a small fire pit, and together they watched the pages curl, blacken, and lift into the wind, each one carrying something she no longer needed to hold. The last one she fed into the flame herself, whispering, Goodbye. When the fire dimmed to embers, she didn't move. Elijah stepped behind her, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. She turned into his chest and let herself be held. Not because she was broken, but because she was whole and ready. This place, this life, she whispered. It could be more. He looked down at her. It already is. The prairie wind picked up again, cool and clean, and in that wind, the past blew away like ash and old dust, leaving only two people, a quiet home, and the space to build something real. Spring arrived with the scent of wildflowers and the promise of new life. Mara had taken to the mornings with energy Elijah hadn't expected, planting herbs, stitching curtains, even trying her hand at fence mending. The ranch, long, quiet, and functional, began to feel like a home. Elijah noticed it in the little things. The smell of fresh bread when he came in from the fields. The sound of Mara humming while she swept the porch. The way her eyes lit up when he brought her wild daisies in a battered tin cup. You know, she said one morning as they stood by the garden, I used to think roots meant being trapped. Now I think they mean growing. Elijah grinned. You've got a gift for saying more in fewer words than most preachers in a year. She looked up at him. And you've got a gift for hearing what nobody else ever bothered to listen to. Later that week, a traveling photographer passed through the valley. He had a cart full of gear and offered to take portraits for a few coins. Mara hesitated. I never liked being looked at, she admitted. Elijah met her eyes. But now you get to decide how you're seen. So they sat together for the photo. Mara in a simple cream dress, Elijah in his usual worn shirt, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. The photographer gave them a copy the next morning. They framed it and hung it in the parlor. Mara stared at it for a long time before saying softly, That woman looks free. And Elijah answered without a moment's pause, She is. But life on the plains was never just peace and poetry. A drought crept in. Crops withered. One of the mares took ill. And still Mara stood beside him through it all. Not as someone needing rescue, but as someone who belonged. She handled the accounts, helped birth a breech calf, even bargained hard for supplies when traders passed through. One night, after a long day patching fence lines and clearing out dry brush, Elijah sat beside her under the stars. You ever think you'd end up here? Mara leaned into him. Never. But now I can't imagine being anywhere else. They stayed like that, listening to the wind sweep across the plains, their silence full of everything they didn't need to say. It arrived on a wind-blown afternoon in early summer, just one envelope stained with dust and time tucked into the post bag like any other. Elijah tossed it onto the kitchen table, not thinking much of it, until Mara picked it up. Her fingers froze mid-motion, her expression unreadable. The handwriting. Familiar. Slanted. Harsh. She didn't say a word. Elijah watched her from the doorway that evening, the unopened letter resting on her lap. "You don't have to read it," he said gently. "I know," she replied, "but I want to. I'm just not sure who I'll be after I do." He nodded once, then turned back to the stove. By candlelight, she opened it. And read every word. A single page. No apologies, no explanations, just a line that chilled her. "You always belong to me." Mara folded it carefully, then placed it into the fire without a sound. The paper curled, then vanished. She watched the flame flicker, her jaw tight. Then softly, he was wrong. The next day, she went to the barn, saddled her mare, and rode out alone. Elijah didn't ask where. He just waited. At dusk, she returned, her cheeks windswept and her eyes glowing with something fierce and free. "I went to the ridge," she said, "to say goodbye." To him? To who I was when I was afraid of him. Later that week, Mara brought out a stack of blank paper. "I want to write women like me. Girls still out there." Elijah raised a brow. "You want to write letters?" "I want to start with one. Just one. Because I wish someone had sent me one before I left that place." And so every week Mara wrote one letter, each addressed to the girl who thinks she's alone, each ending with, "You are not. I see you, I made it out, and you can too." And soon the replies came. From mining towns, from lonely wagons, from riverboats, from the cracked windows of locked bedrooms. And Mara replied to each, her heart in every word. By late summer, word of Mara's letters had traveled farther than either she or Elijah had expected. The local schoolteacher asked her to speak. Then the pastor's wife invited her to host a circle for women who'd long held their silence. One woman came with a black eye, another with a child on her hip and shame in her voice. Mara didn't speak as a savior. She spoke as a survivor, and that made all the difference. Meanwhile, the skies turned dark. Rain was late. The creek ran low. Tempers in town ran shorter than usual. And then came the storm. Not thunder or wind, but a man. From Mara's past. He showed up outside the general store, asking questions in a voice too smooth to be honest. Claimed he was her cousin. A traveler. "Just looking for someone," he said. Elijah heard of it through the blacksmith before he ever saw the man. And when he did, his blood went cold. Not from fear. From instinct. Elijah didn't confront him in public. That wasn't his way. Instead, he rode back to the ranch and found Mara already waiting on the porch. She didn't need to be told. "He's here," she said. "Are you afraid?" Elijah asked. "Not anymore." That night she wrote one final letter. Not to a girl, but to the man who thought he still had power over her. She wrote, "You don't own my silence. You don't own my story. You never did." Then she burned the letter beneath the same sky she used to look at through the bars of fear. And in the ashes, something new began to grow. The man never came to the ranch. Maybe he got the message. Or maybe he finally realized she wasn't the same girl who had been sold and silenced. She was a woman now. Loved. Heard. Free. And in the weeks that followed, Mara found herself doing something she never thought she'd do. Smiling for no reason. The rains finally came. First in soft whispers, then in thunderous release. The parched earth drank greedily, and the fields around the ranch turned from brittle yellow to thriving green. It was as if the land, like Mara, had waited for a season of healing. And now, it had arrived. Mara stood on the porch as the rain fell, not hiding from it, letting it kiss her cheeks, run through her hair. She looked toward the distant hills, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was surviving anymore. She was living. Inside, Elijah mended the saddle straps with steady hands. He watched her through the window, a quiet smile curling at the edge of his lips. He hadn't asked her for anything, never pressed for promises or vows or more than she could give. But she had given something precious just the same. Trust. And day by day, that trust had grown into something deeper. One evening, Mara entered the barn with 2 mugs of coffee, sat beside him on a hay bale, and said softly, "I never thought love could be gentle." Elijah glanced up. "What do you mean? I thought it had to be earned, or endured, that it came with bruises or bargains." She looked at him, voice barely above a whisper. "But with you, it just exists, quiet, solid, like the sky." He took her hand then, not rushed, not possessive, just warm and sure. "Love doesn't shout," he said, "not the kind that lasts." In the weeks that followed, they began to rebuild not just their land, but their lives. Mara painted the spare bedroom, turning it into a small study for her letters. Elijah repaired the fence near the northern field, hammering nails like punctuation marks in a life being rewritten. One morning, a wagon arrived, driven by the same woman Mara had once written to. The girl stepped down, a small child in tow and eyes full of exhausted hope. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. Mara only smiled. "Then you came to the right place." The ranch became more than a home. It became a refuge. And the walls that once held only silence now echoed with laughter, stories, and the clatter of new beginnings. By early autumn, the ranch no longer felt like it belonged to just Elijah and Mara. It was still their home. But something had shifted. With each woman who arrived at the gate, clutching a child or a letter or just her last hope, the place grew larger, not in size, but in purpose. There were no formal announcements, no sign that read "Safe Haven," just word of mouth, passed between trembling lips and whispered in letters like the ones Mara used to write. And somehow they found their way there. Mara kept a wooden box on her desk filled with folded notes from those who stayed, even briefly. Some just said thank you. Others told fragments of unspeakable stories. One simply read, "He never touched me again, because I left, because of you." She didn't cry when she read them anymore. Not because they didn't matter, but because strength had taken root where fear once bloomed. Elijah never asked questions when a new woman came. He just made sure the fence was secure, the roof didn't leak, and the fire stayed warm. He built bunk beds in the loft above the barn, added more hooks for coats, a bigger table for supper. And when folks in town asked about the women, he'd only say, "They're family now, that's all you need to know." One night, as leaves danced in the wind outside, Mara brought out a paper-wrapped box and handed it to Elijah by the firelight. "What's this?" he asked. "Open it." Inside was a pair of leather gloves. Strong, well-stitched, meant for hard work, but lined with softness inside. "You gave me shelter when I didn't have a voice," Mara said. "Now I want to give you comfort for those quiet hands." Elijah didn't answer right away. He simply slid them on, held her face gently between them, and kissed her, as if she were made of morning light. Later that evening, after everyone was asleep and the ranch had gone still, Mara stepped outside. The stars above were endless. Elijah joined her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" he asked. She leaned into him, smiling. "No, because now it lives inside me." Winter rolled in like a hushed breath, soft at first, then fierce. Snow blanketed the hills, muted the trails, and turned the ranch into a quiet world of white and firelight. For many, the season meant stillness. For Mara, it meant remembering. The girl she had been, the one who had lived under the weight of cruel hands and crueler words, would have feared the long nights. But now, those same nights wrapped around her like a quilt, not a cage. Inside the ranch house, the fireplace became the center of gravity. The warmth pulled them all in. Elijah, Mara, the women who stayed, the children who giggled on the floor with carved toys Elijah had made in his spare hours. One boy, no older than 6, climbed onto Mara's lap one evening and asked, "Were you always brave?" She looked into his eyes, touched his cheek gently, and replied, "No, but I always wanted to be." The women began taking care of the ranch as their own. Sarah, the first to arrive after Mara, learned how to ride and gather eggs. June, once too frightened to speak above a whisper, now read aloud from a tattered book every evening after supper. They were healing, not because they had forgotten the past, but because they were finally allowed to exist beyond it. Elijah sometimes watched it all from the edge of the porch, quietly carving small wooden hearts he left on windowsills and nightstands. He never said they were from him, but they always appeared on days when someone needed reminding they were seen. Mara knew, though. Of course she knew. One evening, as the snow swirled outside and shadows danced on the walls, Elijah sat beside Mara with a folded piece of parchment. "Wrote something," he muttered, clearly unsure. Mara unfolded the paper. Inside, in Elijah's neat block letters, was a single line. "You never needed saving, just space to grow." Her eyes welled, but her smile was steady. "You gave me that," she whispered. "No," he said, "you claimed it." That night, she kissed him slowly, without fear, without hesitation. Not a kiss to thank or to ask, but one to say, "This is my choice. This is my love. This is..." And when the candlelight flickered low and the snow kept falling outside, Mara realized something she'd never thought possible. She wasn't waiting for her life to begin anymore. She was already living it. Spring didn't burst onto the land. It crept in softly, like healing. The snow melted slowly into the thirsty earth, and the trees stretched toward the sun as if waking from a dream. On the ranch, everything was changing, but nothing felt rushed. Mara stood barefoot in the garden one morning, turning the soil with her fingers. Tiny green shoots peeked up through the dark earth. Life. Again and again. Life. Behind her, Elijah approached quietly, as always. He held a plank of polished cedar in his hands. "Thought the place could use a name," he said. Mara wiped her hands and tilted her head. "You did?" He nodded, then turned the board so she could read it. Burned gently into the wood were 3 words. Hollowhaven Ranch. Her breath caught. "Why that?" Elijah scratched at the back of his neck. "Well, we all come here feeling empty. Hollow. But it's a place to fill back up. Safe, quiet, full of hope. Quiet. Full." She ran her fingers over the letters, her eyes misting. "It's perfect." They mounted the sign together at the edge of the road. A few of the children watched, giggling as the wind caught their hair. Some women stood by the fence, arms linked. No one said much. They didn't need to. The ranch wasn't just a place anymore. It was a promise. Later that night, Mara sat with a notebook by the fire, writing a letter. Not to anyone in particular, just to the girl she had once been. "You were never broken, just bruised. You were never silent, just unheard. And you were never unworthy, not for a single moment." She closed the book, set it aside, and looked up to see Elijah watching her with that quiet gaze. "What now?" he asked. She smiled. "Now we keep living, and loving, and leaving the porch light on for the next one who needs it." And they did. Through every season, through every scar, through every unexpected knock at the door, they stayed. Together. At a ranch built not with bricks or timber, but with second chances.